Hello, my name is Eric Winkelspect. I'm a software engineer. This is another entry in my Learning Out Loud video series where I talk about current or past projects and look at the code that makes them work. We're revisiting the Kanban task tracker application of front-end mentor challenge, and this looks a lot different than it did in the previous video. I spent some time going through and making this look more aesthetically like the end product should. So at this point we have our sidebar and top nav bar. We've got our hover effects on everything. We can click and have our boards appear here for us. We have a toggle for our light and dark theme, which I have as a kind of fade right now. I think that looks a little bit nicer than just flashing right to the dark theme or the light theme. And we can hide our sidebar here and show. The sidebar itself is not visible on mobile views. That's when our top nav kicks in. We can click this, which has a nice drop down. It does the same kind of work here. You can also see that our pop-ups have a nice dark background so that anything that we open up, we have that background, nothing else is clickable, and we click that background and close our pop-up. So things are looking good. Next steps really are just working out the functionality of making these things actually stateful, allowing our updates to each task. Right now this is just reading off of a static data, so everything looks and is responding the way it's supposed to, so I'm happy about that. What I do want to look at today is I want to talk about the React useContext hook. So things like our theme, our color theming. Really good use of useContext. It's a nice way to avoid prop drilling. Now I was using context a very simplistic way the last time we looked at this application, which did the basic job but wasn't really helpful in the way I needed it to be. I would, basically just create useContext. So let's look at what I've got actually. I basically only had this line to create context, name it whatever you want to name it, and then wrap that around your elements in React. Then you can pass down a value, and it worked. But if I wanted to pass the setter, I was still kind of passing things the same way. So I found another resource. I was looking up different resources on useContext and Typescript specifically, and it was really hard to find a good resource. I found one YouTube video that was extremely helpful, and I'll put a link to that in the description of this particular video on YouTube. So if you're watching it somewhere else, like on LinkedIn, make sure you're visiting the actual YouTube page and check the comments or the description there for that link. But I want to run through how this helps and what this really does for us, and how to set this thing up. So what I'm actually going to do is we can talk through this really quick. We're importing create context and use state. We're setting up our types here. So if you're not using TypeScript, I'm a little bit newer in the TypeScript world, but I'm working with it because it's a lot nicer to have the benefits of it than just JavaScript on its own. We export our context from create context, naming it whatever we're naming it, and then we have our actual called functional component here, or useContext component, where we set our provider, right? So we'll walk through this and actually type all this stuff up, so we see where we can get these things like this type here, the set theme type, because these can be a little bit confusing when it comes to TypeScript and React. So I'm just going to open up a new file over here, and we will just do test context.tsx. Great. So the first thing we're going to do, excuse me, is we're going to import, and we want to import create context and also I want to import useState, right? So the reason I want to do this is I don't want to just have a context that I can pass a value through an entire application. I want to be able to call my context in any part of my application and change a state in any part without passing down that state or having to set the state value at the highest level of the application, like the main app. So we'll talk about establishing our types in a second. But the next thing we're going to do is we're going to export, and we'll do our test context equals create context, and we're just going to list this with a null value for now. Const would be better there. All right, cool. And then we'll do our const. We'll call it global test equals, this is our function, and in here we'll do our useState. So we'll say test and set test equals useState, and we'll give this a default of just, I don't know, testing. Sure, why not? And we'll have our return value. So what our context does is context has, we're doing global, we're doing test context. So I'm not going to capitalize here because I think that's the appropriate way to do that. So we're going to have test context dot provider. So dot provider is what you would wrap around your components to make sure they're actually able to receive whatever your context is. And you can see we got a squiggly line here from Typescript saying that property value is missing. So the dot provider does require a value, and right now I'm just gonna, if I can type that correctly, we'll just leave that empty for the moment. And the other thing we're going to do here is this, in effect, is going to wrap around all of our components, right? So in here, we're going to have children that are passed into this provider. So we're actually going to put that in here. And we can just do it like this. And when we do that, we need to make sure we actually pass children in as a prop here. But this is when TypeScript kicks in and says, hey, this is an implicit any type, right? So since we didn't actually declare our types here, TypeScript is just going to infer this as any. It doesn't have anything else to go off of at the moment. So let's start looking at types. When you are passing in props into any of your components in React with TypeScript, what I like to do is I just like to make this simple. I just say type props. And whatever I'm going to pass in, if say we were passing in, like you had a counter value that returned a number, then it would be, I'm passing in counter and it's a number, and that would be my type. But in this case, we're passing in children, which is a very specific thing with React. It's React node, right? It is a functional component. It is a node element. React node. So we're going to call it that. So once we're here, we're going to put that in our brackets, which is destructuring our passed in prop here, and we're going to type it, and we're going to say props. So now it's happy, because now you can see props understands that it is children is the name, and it is our type is React node. So TypeScript from React is happy with us now doing that. And the other thing is we still need this value here in the provider, right? And we should already assume, because it's TypeScript, that it's going to need some kind of understanding of what that is as well. Right now it also says any, right? So we're going to do the same thing here. And I need to have my type, and I also just want to call this context. You can name either of these whatever you want to name them. But for me, it's, I like anything props I'm passing in, I'm just going to type it props. If it's context specific that's going to go into my value, I'm just in the habit of calling it context now. So here, the value is, as we mentioned before, what's going to go through every component that we import this context into. And we're going to pass test and set test. So we're going to pass test, and we're going to pass set test. And what are these going to be? Well, test right now, we gave this a default value of testing. So TypeScript is inferring that this is going to be a string, and I'm okay with that. Let's keep it at that. So we know test is going to be a string, and set test, if I hover over this, we get this big old react.dispatch react.set state action string. Cool. That's what our setter function is as a type, and we're just going to go ahead and pop that right in there, and that's going to be good enough for us. If I didn't actually have this on here, you can see if I hover over this, it has undefined in this little section over here. If we had this as a true false, it assumes this is a Boolean, which would be correct in that case. If I have a null value here, it's going to say this is null. So whatever you need it to be, if it's an object of some kind, you know, objects or arrays or whatever you have going on here. So we're just going to have this be our string for right now, and it's just going to be testing. So now in our value here, we can actually pass in, and I'm getting rid of those parentheses for other brackets. We're going to pass in our test and our set test. And what is angry here? Right. So the one thing I'm forgetting about here is create context, which right now I just have as null, right? And this is saying like, hey, you can't assign the string and setter function string to a null value. Create context here, this null is looking and matching with this value that we're passing out. So the reason why we're putting this context type here is because we need to tell TypeScript what our type for create context is, right? So right now it says create context null. We're going to actually type that out this way, and we're going to say it's going to be our context type, or we'll call it null. And now everything is happy here. So that's awesome. So next thing we're going to do now that we have that all set up is we're going to import, well, actually I'm not done, export default, and I want to do my global test, right? So my wrapper that we're going to use somewhere in our app is going to be our global test, and we will import test context into whatever child component needs to use this testing context. So now that we have all that done, we're going to assume this is going to work in the similar way to our theme context. And I'm going to go to my main TSX, which just has my app around it. And we're going to import, now that we've made our test, what did I call it, global test. We have this in context, and we called it test context, right? Am I mistaken? Global test, excellent. So we'll wrap our whole app in global test. So then everything within our app is going to have access to global test now. We'll still have to import the context, but everything's going to have access to global test. So if we go through and we look at, for example, I don't know, let's say these card elements here that I have, these are under my views, these are my task preview cards. So what we'll do now then is, from our test context, we've already put global test around our entire app. Now we're going to import test context, right? Because that's our create context, quote unquote. We're going to import that. So we will import test context from, we have context and test context. Cool. Now, within our function here, we need to say something like const test context. You could name this technically whatever you want to. We're going to say useContext. I have useContext already imported here. useContext, and this is going to be our capital letter T, test context. Cool. So you can see here we've got this set up. And now if I'm going to use that test context, if I start typing test context lowercase, putting the period after that, it's going to show me what my two options are being passed in from context, right? So I've got test and set test, which are the things that we set up to send out. So if I were to say within the element here, let me just throw another h1, I don't really care. And let's just put our test context dot test. And now we can see we've got our testing string on every single one of these, right? And the other thing that we can do now is if we let's change this to a button, right? Now I've got a testing button, and let's make another function here. We can just do right up here, why not? Let test func, and then we'll say we'll just make this easy, and we'll do test context dot set test, and this is where we can throw in whatever string we want to set in here, right? Because we can also see that TypeScript is telling us this should be a string here, and we're just going to do changed, and we'll save that. We will set my on click down here on my button, on click, and we call that test func, and there we go. Now we have that changed. The whole thing, if I click on this whole card, it makes that pop-up come up, as we can see. But that's, in effect, how useContext works. You know, I'm not an expert on useContext at this point. I'm just understanding a more complex way to use the useContext hook. As I mentioned before, I'm going to drop a link to the resource that I found on YouTube. It did a much better job explaining this whole thing than I did. And I highly recommend running through that video as well if you're using useContext with TypeScript. If you're not using TypeScript, it's the same stuff just without typing, so have at it. But it is definitely a very useful way to handle things like theme, or, you know, there's a lot more you can do with useContext. You can handle larger things of useContext, but I'm only using theme in this particular application. And speaking of, you know, I'm very happy with how this thing's turning out so far. Had a little bit of a challenge with how I actually wanted to set up this sidebar. Attempted to use GSAP, which is an animation library I'm very fond of, but it caused some other display bugs that I wasn't anticipating, so I ended up just using different width settings in my CSS. So I have a data attribute on this. I actually had to, in order to make all this work correctly, we'll shift gears real quick. In order to make all that work correctly, I set a state at the very top of my application. So here's my sidebar state, which defaults to true. And what I'm using for informing everything that we've got the sidebar visible is a data attribute. So data attributes, if you haven't used them with HTML markup, data attributes are just a way you can add custom attributes to your tags, and, you know, pass in different information. You tend to see those kinds of things like with like checked and unchecked and things, but here's a custom value. So if sidebar, we return this, otherwise it's hidden. Rather than using another class on top of classes, this was just a cleaner way to do this. So, you know, if we hit that button, it changes our sidebar from true to false, and it passes that information down. I can go into more depth of this with this in another video if it's interesting to folks out there. or any other part of this application. If you want more explanation on how some of this is working, feel free to let me know. Reach out, say hello. Any questions about anything that's going on with this application, or if you want me to dive into some other topics that I might be working with, feel free to reach out and give your feedback as well. Thanks for watching. See you next time.